Sarah Jamwal here. I am the co-founder of the Wired Ape, a platform built on one thesis, that you are a Stone Age animal navigating a modern world, and that the gap between those two things is where most human suffering lives. Scholar's Fire is where we go deep. No shortcuts, no summaries. One thinker, one framework, one idea examined from every angle, until it gives up something true. Runtime 30 to 40 minutes. Let's begin. Last time on Scholar's Fire, we examined the identity lock layer of the GTOS lens through the work of Paul Ricoeur and the narrative architecture of the self, how the stories we tell about who we are become the cage we cannot see. Today we move from the individual to the civilisational. From the story one person tells about themselves to the story an entire species tells about its relationship with the planet it lives on. And we are going to start, of all places, on Mars. The GTOS layer we are working with today is the seventh and final layer, the future self gap. The future self gap is the brain's systematic inability to fully identify with its own future version. Research by Hal Hirschfield at UCLA using neuroimaging documented something that should stop every one of us cold. When participants were shown images of their future selves, the neural activity pattern matched the pattern produced when they thought about strangers, not about themselves. Your brain does not experience your future self as you. It experiences your future self as someone else, a stranger, someone you feel a degree of empathy toward, perhaps, the way you may feel toward a person you do not know who is described as being in difficulty, but not someone whose interests you weigh as heavily as your own present interests. Now, scale that finding from the individual to the civilisational level. If the individual brain systematically underweights the interests of its own future self, what does a civilization do to the interest of the generations that will inherit the planet it is currently managing? And what does a planet do, if a planet ever hosted a species capable of making choices, when that species has no ritual architecture for closing the future self gap? Mars, as of a study published in Nature this week, appears to have had an ocean, and it lost everything. That is where we begin. A study published in Nature on April 15, 2026 by Abdallah Zaki and Michael Lamb identified a flat zone on the Martian surface between approximately 1,800 and 3,800 meters below the Martian datum, the reference level, equivalent to Earth's sea level, that exhibits the topographic characteristics of a continental coastal shelf. On Earth, continental shelves sit between 410 meters and 15 meters below sea level. They have a specific slope, a specific curvature, a specific set of geomorphic signatures that distinguish them from other underwater terrain features. The Martian zone Zaki and Lamb identified has the same signatures, adjusted for Martian gravity, Martian geological history, and the specific tectonic forces that shape the planet's surfaces over billions of years. The zone covers approximately 10.2 million square kilometers, roughly 7% of the Martian surface. Within the zone, researchers identified 48 interpreted deltas, the sedimentary fan structures that form where rivers meet standing bodies of water. They identified 14,386 layered mounds of sedimentary rock up to 500 meters thick. They identified clay-bearing stratigraphy, the layered rock formations that on Earth are associated with prolonged water exposure and the kind of chemical conditions that support biological processes. And the Chinese Zhurong rover, operating on the Utopia Planitia region, approximately 150 kilometers north of the mapped shelf, detected 10 to 35 meters of subsurface sediment with unidirectional dipping beds inclined in what would have been the seaward direction, exactly the pattern expected from continental margin coastal deposits. Mars had an ocean. The evidence is not speculative. It is topographic, sedimentary, mineralogical, and now confirmed by direct rover subsurface detection. Mars had an ocean large enough to cover 1/3 of its surface. It had river systems feeding into that ocean. The deltas are the evidence. It had the chemical conditions that on Earth preceded and accompanied the emergence of life, and it lost all of it. The Mars ocean is not a story about another planet. It is a mirror. It is the most complete natural experiment we have ever found in the universe for the question that planetary anthropology has been building toward for decades. What does it take for a planet to maintain the conditions for complex life across a geological time? And what happens when those conditions are lost? To answer that question properly, I want to bring in two thinkers whose work has been waiting for exactly this moment. The first is Robin Wall Kimmerer. The second is Aldo Leopold. Kimmerer is a botanist and member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation. Her 2013 book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is one of the most important scientific and philosophical texts of the last 20 years. Not because it is beautiful, though it is extraordinarily beautiful, but because it makes an argument that Western science has spent 3 centuries building the tools to understand and has only recently begun to accept. The argument is this: the plants, the animals, the ecosystems, the watersheds, and the atmospheric systems that sustain life on Earth are not resources. They are relationships, and relationships require reciprocity, the mutual exchange of care, attention, and obligation to remain alive. Kimmerer draws on the Potawatomi concept of the honorable harvest, a set of protocols governing the relationship between the human community and the world and the living world from which it takes. You never take more than you need. You never take more than half. You take only what is given. You give thanks for what is taken. You give back in proportion to what you receive. And you carry the memory of the obligation forward, not just in your own lifetime, but in the practices you pass on to the next generation. This is not poetry. This is ecology encoded in ritual practice. The honorable harvest is a set of behavioral protocols that, if followed across generations, maintain the biological productivity of the ecosystems a community depends on. The never take more than half rule is a direct application of sustainable yields, the ecological principle that a population can sustain harvest up to approximately half its annual production without declining. The give back in proportion to what you receive rule encodes the nutrient cycling that every ecosystem requires to maintain its productive capacity over time. The Potawatomi did not arrive at these protocols through Western scientific method. They arrived through generations of careful observation, encoded in ritual practice, transmitted through ceremony rather than through textbook, and made binding through the social architecture of spiritual obligation rather than through legal enforcement. And they worked. For thousands of years, they worked. Now, bring Aldo Leopold into the conversation. Leopold was an ecologist writing in the first half of the 20th century. A Sand County Almanac was published in 1949, the year after he died. He is most famous for the land ethic, the argument that the ethical community to which humans owe moral consideration must be extended beyond other humans to include soils, waters, plants, and animals. Leopold's central observation, made from decades of watching ecosystems degrade and sometimes recover under human management, was that the health of a land community can only be maintained by a community of humans who are in intimate, reciprocal, observational relationship with it, not managing it from a distance, not extracting from it through industrial systems that process its output without anyone ever touching the soil, but present, attentive, seasonally engaged, ritually accountable. He said that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends that sentiment from 1949 is the honorable harvest in Western scientific language. It is Kimmerer's reciprocity and ecological philosophy language. And it is, I'm going to argue, the answer to the Mars question. What did Mars lack that Earth has, at least so far, maintained? Not water. Mars had water, not chemistry. Mars had the right chemistry, not time. Mars had billions of years. What Mars lacked, as far as we can observe, was a species capable of entering into reciprocal ritual relationship with its planetary systems and maintaining that relationship across geological time. Now, you might say, but there was no life on Mars. There was no species to maintain a ritual relationship. And you would be right. That is exactly the point. The question is not whether Mars had a species that failed to maintain its ecological rituals. The question is whether Earth has one, and whether that species is currently behaving more like a planet that maintained its rituals or more like a planet that did not. The Canopy Layer is the Wired Ape's framework for the invisible structural level of any system: ecological, social, civilisational, that determines everything happening below it. In a forest, the canopy determines the light, the moisture, the species composition, the entire character of the ecosystem beneath it. You cannot understand the forest floor without understanding the canopy. At the planetary scale, the canopy layer of any civilization's relationship with its ecological systems is its ritual architecture, the ceremonies that mark the seasons, the land stewardship practices that encode ecological knowledge in repeated embodied action, the regeneration observances that remind the community of its obligation to the living worlds, the harvest protocols that make the taking of resources a moral and relational act rather than a purely economic one. When the canopy layer ritual architecture is intact, the ecological knowledge it encodes is maintained across generations automatically, not through conscious decision-making, not through institutional memory, but through the body, through the hands that perform the same actions their grandparents' hands performed, through the feet that walk the same seasonal paths, through the voices that sing the same songs at the same times of year, in the same places. When the canopy layer ritual architecture collapses, when the ceremonies are abandoned, when the seasonal observances are replaced by the industrial calendar, when the harvest protocols are superseded by market efficiency, the ecological knowledge they encoded does not simply transfer to a different storage medium. It evaporates. It disappears from the community's operational knowledge base at exactly the speed at which the last generation that embodied it dies. This is not metaphor. This is documented history. Let me give you two examples from outside the Western mainstream. The first is the Aboriginal Australian practice of cultural burning, the seasonal fire management protocols maintained by First Nations communities across the Australian continent for at least 50,000 years. Cultural burning is not wildfire management in the Western sense. It is not a technical intervention applied to a landscape by specialists with equipment. It is a seasonal ritual, a structured, repeated, communal practice embedded in spiritual obligation, governed by protocols about when, where, how, and by whom fire is applied to country, the Aboriginal term for the living landscape understood as a relational entity with its own needs and agency. The ecological outcomes of cultural burning, documented by historian Bill Gamage in The Biggest Estate on Earth, and confirmed by subsequent ecological research, are extraordinary. The pre-colonial Australian landscape maintained by cultural burning had higher biodiversity, more stable water systems, lower catastrophic fire risk, and greater long-term ecological productivity than the same landscapes managed through 20th century Western land management practices. When cultural burning was suppressed through colonial land management policies beginning in the 19th century, the ecological knowledge it encoded did not transfer to the replacement management systems. It could not, because the knowledge was not stored in documents or databases. It was stored in the bodies of practitioners, in the seasonal rhythms of the practices, in the spiritual protocols that governed its application. When the practice stopped, the knowledge stopped with it, and the landscape began to shift toward the catastrophic fire conditions that now characterize much of the Australian continent. The second example is the Andean sowing ceremony system of the Quechua people, specifically the ritual calendar that governs the agricultural practices of highland communities in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. The Quechua agricultural ritual calendar is one of the most sophisticated ecological management systems ever documented. Every stage of the agricultural cycle, soil preparation, seed selection, planting, irrigation, harvest, storage, and seed saving for the following year, is governed by ceremony. The ceremonies are not blessings performed over agricultural activities. They are the activities. The ritual is the agricultural practice. They are inseparable. The specific outcome this produces that Western agronomy was spent decades trying to replicate through technological means is the maintenance of extraordinary agricultural biodiversity across extreme altitudinal gradients. The Quechua communities of the Andes maintain over 3,000 varieties of potato, not as genetic preservation projects, not as museum collections, as living, cultivated, ritually maintained agricultural diversity that provides ecological resilience against the extreme weather variability of the Andean highlands. When Quechua communities lose the ritual calendar, through urbanization, economic disruption, or cultural marginalization, the agricultural biodiversity does not simply move to a seed bank. It collapses because the diversity was never maintained by storage. It was maintained by the ritual practice of planting, tending, harvesting, and selecting across thousands of individually managed plots, governed by ceremonial protocols that distributed the work of ecological maintenance across the entire community. Two continents, two completely independent traditions. The ritual architecture is the ecological management system. They are not separable. Remove one and you have removed both. Now return to Mars. Mars had water. Mars had chemistry. Mars had billions of years. What Mars did not have, as far as we know, was a species capable of entering into the kind of reciprocal, ritual, intergenerational relationship with its planetary systems that the Potawatomi Honorable Harvest describes, that Aboriginal cultural burning embodies, and that the Quechua sowing ceremony maintains. And Mars is now a desert, with a preserved coastal shelf and 14,386 sedimentary mounds as the record of what used to be there. The Stone Age signal running through this entire episode is the one that the Wired Ape comes back to most consistently: the drive to extract, to consume, to prioritize the immediate over the future, to treat the living world as a resource rather than a relationship. This drive is not evil. It is not stupidity. It is a survival architecture that was extraordinarily adaptive for most of human evolutionary history. In a world of genuine scarcity, genuine unpredictability, and genuine immediate threat, the brain that maximized present extraction was the brain that survived. The brain that withheld extraction for the benefit of a future it could not see was the brain that starved. The future self gap is the neural mechanism of that architecture. The brain that cannot fully identify with its future self cannot fully identify with its children's future, cannot fully identify with the generation that will inherit the soil it is currently depleting, cannot fully identify with the planetary systems that will either support or fail to support life across geological time. The Stone Age signal is correct for its original environments. It is catastrophically mismatched for a species with the technological capacity to alter planetary systems at geological scale. And here is the mismatch lag at its most profound. Our technological capacity to alter the planetary canopy layer has increased by orders of magnitude in 200 years. Our neural architecture for caring about the future consequences of those alterations has not changed at all. Every traditional culture that maintained ecological rituals was solving the future gap problem at the community level, encoding the obligation to the future in ceremonial practice so that the community-based behavior toward its ecological systems was governed not by the individual brain's short-term extraction drive, but by the ritual architecture's long-term reciprocity requirements. The ceremony does not ask you to feel like the future. It asks you to act like the future matters. And when you act like the future matters, across generations, in embodied community practice, the future receives enough care to arrive. This is the practitioner bridge for this episode. The ancient wisdom tradition, ecological ritual as civilisational maintenance technology. The specific modern problem, a species with planetary scale technological power and a brain that experiences its own future as a stranger. The practitioner bridge is not abstract. It is not about returning to pre-industrial life. It is about understanding what ecological ritual was actually doing at the neurological, ecological, and civilizational levels, so that we can make informed choices about what to rebuild, what to maintain, and what to create new in its place. Because Mars did not have a choice, we do. 3 books I want to leave in your hands from this episode. The first is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, published in 2013. It is the most important book about the relationship between human beings and the living world written in the last 50 years. Not because it is persuasive, though it is, but because it is precise. Kimmerer is a scientist. She is also a member of a tradition that has been doing planetary ecology through ritual practice for thousands of years. The combination produces a quality of seeing that neither the scientific tradition nor the indigenous tradition produces alone. The second is the Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, published in 1949. Read the land ethics section 3 times, then read it again. It is the most compressed and precise statement of what ecological responsibility at civilisational scale actually requires that Western philosophy has yet produced. The third is The Biggest Estate on Earth by Bill Gammage, published in 2011. It is a detailed historical and ecological account of the pre-colonial Australian landscape as managed through Aboriginal cultural burning practices. It will permanently change the way you understand what a managed landscape looks like when the management is ritual rather than industrial. Mars had an ocean. It had rivers feeding into that ocean. It had the chemical conditions that on Earth preceded the emergence of life. It had a coastal shelf covering 7% of its surface. And it has none of that now. The future self-gap at planetary scale is not a thought experiment. It is a geological record, exactly what can be lost. The canopy layer of human civilization, the ritual architecture that includes our obligation to the future and embodied intergenerational practice, is the single most important structure we maintain or allow to collapse. It is more important than any technology, any policy, any economic system, because it is the structure that determines whether all the others are used in service of the future or at its expense. Robin Wall Kimmerer ends Braiding Sweetgrass with a question that I want to leave with you today. She asks, what does the living world ask of us in return for everything it gives? The answer that every ecological ritual tradition has given, across every culture that has maintained one: attention, gratitude, reciprocity, the willingness to act as though the future is real, even when the brain experiences it as a stranger. That is not a spiritual requirement. That is a survival specification. Mars is the control group. We are the experience. We are the experiment. The Wired Ape is on Substack at substack.com/@thewiredape, on YouTube at youtube.com/@thewiredape, on every podcast platform you already use. Register for Ritual OS early access at thewiredape.fillout.com/ritualos. Take the spiritual DNA quiz at thewiredape.fillout.com/spiritualdna. The sacred secular community for spiritual seekers navigating meaning without institutional religion is at t.thesacredscholar. The Canopy, our master community, is at t.me, the Wired Ape, the Canopy. I am Sarah Jamwal. This is the Scholar's Fire on the Wired Ape. See you next Tuesday.